Good morning. How's everyone? Everybody's good? Good to hear. We've been going through this sermon series this month on promises. I appreciate Josh's song, Standing on the Promises of God. And I just really have been just meditating on this idea and thinking about what all this means and how it relates to us in many ways. I know we've been looking at Abraham and his life and the promises that were made to Abraham and how the promises through this one man, through this one family affect all of us. We are all affected by these promises. We are all affected by his response to those promises. And so we've been going through this series and kind of looking at these ideas, and I always feel like with a topic like this that we underplay the significance of it. I mean, how significant is it that God made a promise to man? I mean, really, if we think about it, if we just sit there and kind of meditate on this idea of God and who God is and what he is able to accomplish and how he has chosen to work through and with us to bring about his great promises. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? It's pretty impressive. It makes us stop and really think about who God is and our relationship to him. And so this morning, I want to ask you a question about gifts. What is the greatest gift that you've ever received? Think about that for just a minute. What's the greatest gift? You know, I think in stages of our life, we probably would answer that differently, don't you think? Right? If you were 8 years old, you probably have a much different answer than when you're in your 20s, right? Or even when you're in your 30s and 40s, your answer to that question is going to change because as we grow and as we mature, we value different things in different ways. And even as we get even older, we begin to think differently about that question. What is the greatest gift that you have ever received? And some of you might be sitting here thinking right now that the greatest gift that you have ever received maybe is your kids. If you're a parent, you have children, that might be your great gift. Or you might be in a stage in your life and you're thinking, you know, my grandkids, those are really the good ones. You know, that's the gift that I prize more than anything, my grandkids. And you might even be sitting there and thinking about maybe not even a family member, but somebody who has given you some advice. I thought about that, you know, somebody who's just given you some good advice over the years, and you really treasure that person's advice, and it has been kind of a turning point in your life, and you think back on it and you think, you know, that was a wonderful gift, that was really good, that I don't know if I would be where I am today if I had not received that person's insight, that knowledge that person has given to me. Or we might even think about relationships in regards to a spouse. We might think that's a good gift. That is a wonderful gift, to share life with somebody else and have experiences with somebody else and to walk in the Lord with someone, that's a great gift. And so there are so many things that we can look at and we can say, well, that's the good one, you know. But I think, you know, we kind of feel obligated, and I think rightfully so, that all of us, if we were to really be honest and put on the very top of our list of the greatest gift that we would have ever received, that the world has ever received, what do you think that would be? What do you think that would be? Jesus, right? I mean, Jesus is the great gift. That the person of Jesus, that God came into the world to coexist with man. That's shocking. It always shocks me. It doesn't matter how many times I think about that or I read it, or every time you read through the Bible, you get to that part of the Bible and you're thinking, what? Did that really happen? Right? I mean, it's almost kind of surreal to think about Jesus because he was more than just a person, right? I mean, we know that. He's more than just a man who was born into the world, but he is God with us. And as Matthew puts it, as he quotes Old Testament passages, that he is Emmanuel. That he is Emmanuel. And we think about that as the greatest gift that we have ever received. And as we've been focusing on these promises, the promises of God this month, last month, it seems like it's been a month, right? It's crazy. But last week we talked about Abraham. We talked about some promises that God made to Abraham. And part of these promises involve not just a land, not just a nation promise, right? Although that's significant and it ties into this idea, but that Abraham would have a child. And to Abraham, that was great, right? To Abraham, that was a gift. To Abraham, that was something that he desired so much in his life. And we looked at the promise to Abraham from God in Genesis 12. So let's read that again. It says, "Then I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse And the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed." And so we kind of know this story. We've heard this story on and off throughout our lives, and we understand what's going on here. But there's certain things in here that really need to pop with us. We need to resonate. We need to stop and think about Abraham is not just a biblical character in history, even though he is, obviously, but he's a man. Right? He has the same hopes and dreams and expectations. He has thoughts and ideas. He has flaws and just like we do, right? He's just a man. And we need to think about Abraham like that, because that's where we need to be. We need to put ourselves in Abraham's place and think, how do we respond to this? What do we think about this? How do we react to words of God that are based on these promises of God that are going to affect not only my future, but the future of those people around me? And so Abraham is given this great promise, and he trusts God, right? We talked about that. He obeyed God, and he left his plush land that he lived in, and how the land that he left behind it wasn't that he was just some poor farmer somewhere and kind of hanging out, and tending to the sheep, but he was wealthy. We're going to learn that Abraham was a wealthy man, that he had a lot, that the land he came from was not just some place that people were pitching tents everywhere and just barely surviving, that the land he left was a land of significance. It was a land of power. It was a land where you would desire to live, and Abraham was willing to leave all that behind and leave his family behind and to go based on the promises of God, to obey God, to trust in his word. And then again, the promise was not just for land. I think that's what we need to really zero in on this morning. The promise was not just for land. The promise was about his future and the future of his family in relation to a son that would be born. And Abraham knew this. Abraham knew that God is telling him that he's going to have a son, that he is going to have an heir to his household, to his everything. And that was so important to Abraham, as it was to many in Abraham's day. And then when you get to Genesis chapter 15, it says, "After all these, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision, saying, 'Do not fear.'" Remember this, his name is Abram, right? Because before he was Abraham, he was Abram. God changed his name. "And do not fear, Abram, I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be great." But I want you to see what the response is. This is what Abraham's thinking about. This is what's on his mind. This is what's on his heart. He says in verse 2, he says, "O Lord, what will you give me?" What are you going to give me? Right? He technically had everything before. He had all kinds of things. He had family, he had wealth, he had everything that he could ever want. And he has left all that behind, and he has quite literally pitched his tent in the Canaanite's backyard, and here he is. And so now he's waiting because the promise is great. He believes it's great. He says, what will you give me? What gift will you give me, since I am childless? And the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus. And Abram said, "Since you have given no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir." See, there's still that sense of frustration, right? There's still, even in chapter 15, there's still that sense of frustration in the story. Sarai is still still barren. She cannot have children. She's not able. She never has been able to have children. That hasn't changed any. Abraham knows that. God knows that. We know that. The story still has tension. There's still frustration that needs to be released. The whole thing with Lot. Remember that whole story with Lot, with bringing Lot along with him. That didn't work out. That whole situation didn't work out. The families became too great, and there was strife in the midst of the herdsmen, and they had to split up, and there was friction there for a little while. There was some tension that needed to be resolved in that story. And even after that, Lot gets himself captured, and Abraham has to gather up the army that's in his household, just to kind of mention Abraham's wealth and power and his greatness. He had an in-house army. And so he has to go and get Lot and save him, rescue him from the captors. So that didn't work out too well. Then we have this other guy, Eliezer. We don't know who he is. We don't know a lot about him. We know that he must have been a servant, probably a high-ranking servant in Abraham's family. And odds are that based on what we have, the little bit that we have, because of his rank, he would have been next in line to receive, because Abraham had no children to receive the inheritance. That's all we know about him. And so the plot just gets thicker and thicker, doesn't it? We're sitting here thinking, what is going to happen? If we hadn't read this story before, and this was the first time, if this was kind of like our first, it's kind of weird to think that, but just put yourself in that place and think, now what? What's God going to do? And we kind of want to get in there and kind of help everybody out and say, it's going to be okay. It's going to be all right, Abraham. It's going to work out. But the frustration is there, and we need to feel it. We need to feel the tension in the story. Look at verse 4. It says, behold, in verse 4, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, this man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir. Then again, this must have been incredibly frustrating for Abraham. He trusted God. He believed God. But now he's getting older, isn't he? His wife is getting older, and she still is not able to have children, and time is passing, and time feels like it's just slipping by. You ever felt that way? Just so much that needs to be done and so many things that I want to do, but time just keeps slipping by. And with Abram, that's what's happening. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating. And then when you get to verse 5, it says, and he took him aside and he said, could you imagine? I don't even know if I could even comprehend this part of the passage. Could you imagine God taking you outside and just look at the stars? Count them. If you're able to count them, look at the stars. And then he says, so shall be your descendants, right? That your descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And you can kind of, and I think about this often, this passage, when I go outside at night and I look at the stars, and there's no way you can count them. Don't even try. You fall asleep before you even get past 100 practically. But you look at the stars and they're so numerous. And it just seems like the more you count, the more show up. It just never ends, the abundance of stars. And that's the analogy, isn't it? That's the idea that God is saying to Abram that your descendants will be numerous. You wouldn't even be able to count them all. This is going to happen, right? But there's still that sense of frustration in the story. And verse 6 is kind of like a narrator's comment, because we know that this story was written, most likely Moses wrote these books, and he wrote them long after this all happened. So the readers actually already know what's going to happen, right? And so do we. But nonetheless, this is kind of a commentary footnote here in verse 6. He says, then he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. This kind of shows all of what Abraham's going to do, right? This is a cliff note to kind of say that, this seems tough. It seems frustrating. It seems... But Abraham believed God. He believed God. He trusted in God. He obeyed God, and it's reckoned to him unto righteousness. But then we get to chapter 16. We get to chapter 16, and we have another problem that comes up in the family in chapter 16. So chapter 16, and starting in verse 1, it says, now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children. Still no child. Still no child to Sarah. But this time, it's not Abraham that's going to come up with a solution, right? It's not Abraham who's going to solve the problem. Abraham has already done what he can do. He's made his suggestions. He brought Lot along, and I'm suggesting that probably Lot was Abram's way of getting God to fulfill his promise through that man. That's a possibility. Then he suggests one of his servants, Eliezer. And so Abraham has done his part in bringing about God's promise, but now it's Sarah's turn. She's going to offer a solution to God's problem, right? That's how we see it. And then it said that an Egyptian maid whose name is Hagar, and it said, Sarah said to Abraham, behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. There's this sense of, I don't know if this is how it's supposed to be read. I kind of feel like it's Sarah's way of kind of saying, God hadn't allowed me to do this. That means prevented me. That's how I read it. I don't know if that's supposed to be read that way, but I think in a little bit you'll see that maybe it is supposed to be read that way. The Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go into my maidservant. Perhaps I will obtain children through her. That's her solution. And Abraham does what? He listens to his wife, Sarai. To us, this sounds horrible, doesn't it? We read this and it's like, oh my goodness, what's going on in this family? This is horrible. But as we've learned things over the years and we've researched ancient cultures and we've dug up different artifacts and things, we have found documents that depicted laws of old nations probably during Abraham's lifetime. And this was part of their law, that if the couple could not have children, they could have a servant who would have children for them, and that child would be their child legally. They could claim that child as if it came from their own body. And so this was common, but it wasn't God's intentions, was it? It's not God's plan. This is not what God has in mind. This is not what he has purposed for Abraham and Sarah, but it seems like the only solution at the time in the mind of this couple, and they go about and they do it. But I want you to specifically focus on that last part of those verses there. Abraham listened to the voice of who? Sarai, right? That's the voice he listened to. Now, if you were reading through Genesis, and this is why I'm thinking that maybe there's a little bit of a blame game here going on with Sarai, because if you were to have read through Genesis all the way through, there was another couple that had a very similar circumstance. Do you remember who they were? One man listened to his wife. Remember that? Who was it? Adam and Eve, right? It's a replay of the same story. It's a replay of the same story. God says one thing, right? And Eve says another. And Adam listened to his wife and ate of the fruit, and we know the rest of that story didn't end up all that well. Of course, this isn't saying that you shouldn't listen to your wife, guys. That's not the point. But as we're reading the narrative, that's how this is all unfolding, isn't it? And so there we go. We have another situation. And what happened then? What happened? What did Adam say about that whole situation? That woman that you gave me. And so here we go. It's a replay of the same story. Over again, we have this happening time and time again. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time here with Hagar, but what we have in the storyline and the narrative is that Hagar becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son whose name is what? Ishmael. Right? And so Ishmael is born into the world, and that creates a lot of tension and strife, and the whole situation just gets more tense and thick. This whole family life is getting pretty intense at this point. And Sarai ends up treating Hagar harshly because she is able to conceive and Sarah could not. And so she ends up having to flee, and there's a lot of other things that go on. Then again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. But like we said last week, when you try to help God, right? When you try to help God fulfill his own promise, what ends up happening? You end up hurting yourself and others, right? That tends to be the message over and over again. When we try to help God out, right, in fulfilling his promise, going around and trying to scheme different ways to make God's promises come to a reality, we often hurt ourselves and we hurt others along with us. Now, we're going to fast forward to Genesis chapter 18. I know there's a lot in this story, and we're just moving forward with it. And Abraham, who is now called, he is now called Abraham, so we can rightfully call him Abraham now, sees three men coming to them. Remember, they're in their tent, and these three men are coming towards the tent, or standing at a distance, as it says. And so he looks up and he sees them, and he invites them to come in and eat with them. Now, you think about this, a big deal, right? I mean, we think about people coming over, we might pull out some leftovers, or something, and, it's a surprise visit, and this was a big deal. This is, go kill the lamb, go make some, unleavened bread. I mean, there was a lot that went on in the story that we kind of pass over, but it's a big deal. And so they feed these men, and as they're eating, and as the story unfolds, we begin to realize that one of these guys is not like the other, right? There's something different. In fact, the text literally calls him Jehovah, the Lord. And so it's God coming to Abraham and speaking with him. And then verse 10, it says, I will surely, Jehovah says, I will surely return to you at this time next year. And behold, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. That's what we've been waiting for. The whole time, right? All of this built up tension and frustration, it's coming to this point in the story. She's going to have a son. The Lord said it. Here it is. It's being confirmed to her. And Sarah was listening at the tent door, which was behind him. Remember, she's kind of listening in on the whole story. But look at verse 11. It said in verse 11, Abraham and Sarah were old. That's a given at this point, but we need to see that. We need to understand. This is a way of saying that, look, the problem's still here. The problem hasn't left. It doesn't mysteriously disappear. There's still tension. There's still friction. And Abraham and Sarah are old, advanced in age, and Sarah was past childbearing. So not only has she gone all this time being barren, not only not able to have children, but now it's kind of a double whammy, right? She was barren, and now she's beyond the age of bearing children. And so there's, some suggest, well, this is kind of like a double miracle, right? If she's going to have children, not only does her womb have to be open, but she's beyond age, right? She is beyond her years of childbearing. In verse 12, and we can't blame Sarah, can we? Because who wouldn't in their mind think this? Right? I mean, if you're in this circumstance, if you've been following the story the whole time, and you've been kind of working along with this, and you get to this part of the chapter, and it says, and Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I have become old, shall I have pleasure? My Lord being old also. Now, some translations use the word within, that she laughed within, which really just gives the impression that, this was something that not everybody probably heard. That she's behind them and she kind of, laughs to herself and thinks, it's not going to happen. I mean, at this point in the game, this far along, we've waited all this time. It hasn't happened yet. We've tried all these different ways, to bring about a son into the family. That hasn't worked out all that well. And now here I am. Not only have I been barren all of my life, but now I am beyond the age of bearing children, period. I'm old. And Abraham's old. And you can't help but feel a little bit of what she's feeling, right? You're thinking, it's not going to happen. Not by natural means anyway. It's not going to happen. And verse 13, it says, and the Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? That might have been a surprise to him too. He probably didn't hear her laugh. At least that seems to be what's implied. And so, he's thinking, I don't know, shall I indeed bear a child when I am old? So not only did the Lord know, that she laughed, that she had that response to those words, but even the words that she said to herself, right? That seems to be the idea, that he's able to even know the thoughts of her mind, that she said these things. And the Lord had heard her. The Lord heard Sarah. And at this point, it seems like, sometimes we just kind of have to assume, but it seems like she had given up hope. It's kind of what it feels like. It feels like she had given up hope, and in her mind, it is just too late. Now, we know that she is a person of faith, right? That's what we read about in the New Testament. We know that she trusted God, but the situation just feels hopeless. It feels hopeless. And I think it's supposed to feel hopeless. I believe that's where we need to be. I think it needs to feel that way, that if something's going to happen, God's going to have to do it, right? That if something's going to happen, that God's going to have to intervene. And look at verse 14. That's exactly what we get, isn't it? Jehovah says, "Is anything too difficult for the Lord?" So that word difficult is a word that's sometimes translated in the Old Testament as wondrous. Wonders. Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? Is anything too wondrous for the Lord? See, this has been the question all along, hasn't it? All throughout the story, this has been the question. Is anything too difficult? Is anything too wondrous for the Lord? Is anything beyond his abilities? Is anything beyond his power? If God is the one making the promise, is there anything that he is not going to be able to accomplish? And that's what Abraham and Sarah need to learn, right? This is the message, as blunt as it is, right? I mean, this is kind of like saying, hey guys, you know me. You know what I can do. Is anything too difficult for me to accomplish? Right? I mean, do you think that I am not able to fulfill this promise? Do you think that I am not capable of doing this thing? And so the frustration, the tension kind of gets released a little bit, right? It's like, oh yeah, it's God. It's Jehovah. It's the Lord. He is the one. And as we move on, we fast forward to chapter 21. In chapter 21, it says, "Then the Lord took note of Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had" what? As he had promised. All this time. And we know you can almost imagine the joy that was. I mean, you know that this was God. You know that it wasn't because Sarah suddenly, somehow had the ability to bear children. You know that didn't happen. You know that as the story has unfolded, that the only way this is going to happen is if God intervenes. And we as we have been kind of experiencing the frustration of the story all along, we're experiencing the joy, right? With this couple. As God is fulfilling his promises and bringing about the very thing that they have desired all along. But I want you to think about this. This is not just some half-hearted story or some biblical record or just some story of history that we just kind of breeze through. But this is deeply rooted in our past. That this story of Abraham and Sarah and God's promise to them and his abilities to bring about the promise to its fullness is preparing us, isn't it? It prepares our hearts, it prepares our minds, it prepares us for the fulfillment of an even greater promise. Do you see that? You see how it's preparing your mind all along, that you feel the tension, you feel the frustration, you feel everything that they're feeling, and then you feel the joy of a child being born into the world. That it's preparing you. It's preparing your heart and your mind to receive an even greater promise. The promise of a child that will be born, right? Not just to a couple, Abraham and Sarah, but a child that will be born into the world that will save the world, right? A child that will be born into the world by the working of God miraculously into the world that will be the Savior of all people. And that's what it's preparing us for, that our minds are being prepped for this moment in time when Jesus will come into the world. And when we get to Matthew chapter 1, we're not surprised at all, right? When we see that an angel comes and meets with Joseph and speaks with Joseph and tells him that the son of David, that's what he calls him, the Son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child who has been conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit, and she will bear a son. And you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Hey, we're not surprised at all, are we? We've come this far. We've walked with these faithful people of God. We've seen God work time and time again. We see that God is a keeper of promises, and we are not even the slightest bit surprised, because our minds and our hearts have been prepared for this moment when God would keep his great promise and bring a child into the world, a Savior into the world. And the day that God himself is born into the world to rescue us from sin and death, and we're not surprised. We're not surprised because nothing is too wonderful for God. We're not surprised because nothing is too difficult for God. We're not surprised because God is fully capable and fully able to bring about and fulfill his great promises and give the greatest gift that mankind has ever received, because our God is a keeper of promises. The greatest gift ever given is Jesus. Do you agree? Greatest gift ever given is Jesus. In Isaiah chapter 9, the prophet Isaiah says, "For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. And there will be no end to the increase of his government or peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this." Has he accomplished that? Has he fulfilled his promise? Has he done what he said that he was going to do? Yes. God is a keeper of promises. And what does that mean to us today? Well, that means that we can rest on the promises of God, right? We can realize that even though it's seemingly impossible, it's almost unimaginable, it seems like that it's never going to happen, that time just keeps slipping on, and the earth and the world just keeps getting older, and time, the frustration of how the world is, it weighs heavy on us. But we know God is a keeper of promises, and we know that God up to this point has always fulfilled, and he has always kept them. And we know that this promise of salvation and an eternal home with him is real, and we believe it. And we're able to work through the frustration and work through the confusion and work through all of the difficulties that life throws at us, because we know that if God is a keeper of promises, which he is, that he will keep his promise to save us from sin and death and rescue us from this world, and that we have a home with him for all eternity. Does that change how you live? Does it change anything about you? It should. It should change everything. Every move that you make, every thought that you have, every action should be fully and completely devoted to our God. And that journey begins when we are baptized into Jesus, doesn't it? When we are immersed in water and we die with Jesus, and we're raised up to walk in newness of life, so that we can walk in the fullness of his promises and live in the fullness of life in the present, so that we may have the fullness of life in the future. If there's anybody here this morning who needs to be baptized into Jesus, put on Jesus in baptism, or if there's anybody who's been struggling on this walk and needs encouragement and strength from the congregation, please come forward as we stand and as we sing.
There's a great